Australia's housing markets turned the corner at the beginning of 2023, and we're now clearly in the upturn stage of the property cycle. But how long is this going to last, and what are the factors that are going to affect the future of our housing markets? To help you understand what's ahead, and if our property markets are going to keep rising, or going to slow down, or even go backwards, as some property pessimists are still suggesting, in today's podcast I want to outline the dynamics and the economics of Australia's housing markets, and what causes property values to increase, and what makes them fall. You see, I want to do this to help you ensure that your investments are going to outperform the market averages over the long term. Now, regular listeners to this show know that I generally have guests on the show, but today, in my mind, this topic's so important, I just wanted it to be you and me as I share what caused our property markets to boom and bust. So, welcome to another episode of the Michael Yardney Podcast.
Welcome to the Michael Yardney Podcast, where twice each week you will learn a number of new ideas regarding success, property investment and money in around 30 minutes. Our show is brought to you by Metropole, who specialise in helping you grow, protect and pass on your wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. Now here's your host, Michael Yardney, Australia's authority in wealth creation through property, who has been voted one of Australia's top 50 most influential thought leaders.
We're now in the upturn phase of the property cycle, and if you believe most of what the media tells you, a lot of it's got to do with supply and demand, but they're also suggesting that what's going to happen to our housing markets moving forward really depends upon what's going to happen to interest rates. But I don't really agree. So to help you understand what's ahead for our markets, I want to share with you a number of the myriad of social, financial, political, economic factors that are going to affect what your family home or your next property investment might be worth. And I'm going to show you that it's actually a lot more than interest rates. So let's first of all start talking about what's going to happen to property values in the short term, what increases property values in the short term, and then I'm going to share some of the long-term drivers. And while interest rates are clearly an important factor, as I said, they're far from the most important factor. Now, obviously, low interest rates make it easier for buyers to borrow more, and when money's cheaper, they feel more confident. And interestingly, though, we've realised, and I've said this if you go back to previous podcasts, and I've had over 6 million downloads of my podcast now, and my notes, my thoughts are on record. I said at the beginning when interest rates rose, that's not necessarily going to stifle our markets, and that's true. So low interest rates make it easier. High interest rates, yeah, they're a barrier, but there's much more than interest rates, and we clearly saw this over the last year when, throughout 2023, despite rising interest rates, house values grew very strongly. Okay, another significant factor that drives our housing markets and heralds the booms and the busts, drives the cycles up and down, is supply and demand. I mean, generally, if demand for accommodation outweighs supply, property values rise. And clearly, that's been a major factor for house price and rental growth over the last couple of years when there's a huge undersupply. But anyone who's been in the property market for a number of years will remember the other side of the cycle, when during building booms there's an oversupply, when we build too many apartments and property values stagnate or fall. That's the way the property cycle works, and it'll happen again. Probably not for a couple of years, but it just seems that all the developers come up with their stock at much the same time, and there's just too much. Now, just to make things clear, I'm talking about the short-term factors that create property cycles as opposed to the long-term factors that create growth, and I'm going to discuss those. But the next one I'd like to mention at the moment is the availability and the cost of land, or the cost of supply of new dwellings. I mean, the lengthy time it takes to release new land supply, on the greenfields, those new housing estates at the edge of our suburbs, edge of our cities, and the vast amount of taxes and charges that developers have to pay when they subdivide new estates is one of the many factors that contributes to the rising house prices around Australia. Of course, another one is just how much extra it costs to build a new home now compared to 2 or 3 years ago. Now, we know the government's keen to build 1.2 million homes in the next 5 years. Look, you heard me say it before, they're not going to build any of them, and they're passed on the problems to the state governments. They're not going to build any either. They're going to have to encourage developers to build. But they're in general suggesting that we should be building more apartments in the inner and middle ring suburbs of our capital cities. But in my mind, this is only going to push up property values. You see, developers are going to have to buy land in the most expensive parts of our cities and then use the most expensive construction techniques. High-rise towers cost much, much, much more to build than building a new home in the outer suburbs. And that's why all the new apartment towers are going to cost significantly more than the current market will currently bear. That's why they're not being built at the moment. But in due course, and I've seen the cycles over and over again, in due course, the cycle will move on and these dwellings will get built. And whether it's investors or overseas investors or build to rent or whoever builds them, it's going to push up the value of established apartments, which currently have significant inbuilt intrinsic value because you're able to buy them at considerably below replacement cost. Now, I've already spoken about interest rates, but it's not only interest rates that drive our cycles up and down, but it's the access to credit, the availability of credit that makes a big difference to our housing markets. Now, looking back over the last decade or so, during periods of rising rates, lenders tended to tighten their lending standards to make sure borrowers could service their loans. And by the way, that's the right thing to do. If you think back to 2016-17, APRA started to tighten the screws when there was a steep increase in property investors. A year or two beforehand, from 2014 onwards, there was a swag of new investors coming into the market to the point where eventually about 50% of all property purchases in Sydney were made by investors. That can't be right. You can't have that. That's a speculative boom. And APRA, the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, instructed banks and other lenders to be more cautious, to set stricter criteria for determining that borrowers could actually repay their loans, especially if interest rates were going to rise. And you may remember this happened. They tightened the screws. Investors had to pay more for their loans. It was harder for investors to borrow, and this caused property values to drop. They dropped about 10% in Sydney in 2016-17 and a smaller amount in Melbourne. And then the markets moved on. The cycles moved on. You've heard me talk about cycles long enough, and until you've invested in 2 or 3 cycles, you won't really understand how critical these ups and down changes are. I've been around now I've been investing for over 50 years, so I can see patterns in the chaos other people are seeing, and the cycle's just moving on. And remember, as I was starting to say, during the pandemic, the banks loosened their screws, they dropped interest rates, they freed up credit to revive the economy, and it worked. And that's one of the reasons why property values surged in 2020 and 2021. And the cycle moved on again, and interest rates rose. APRA increased its serviceability buffers to 3%. Now, that's probably not relevant today. It's out of place today. Oh, by the way, we know that the government wants or needs more investors in the market today, don't they? Because there's not enough supply of accommodation, not enough supply of dwellings. There's lots of reasons why investors have dropped out of the market. And I had a couple of chats in previous podcasts with this. Go back to see the one with Nicola McDougall or Dr. Nicola Powell from Domain. But I think the government could really easily get investors back in the market and provide accommodation, because that's basically what mum and dad investors are, rental accommodation providers, by lowering APRA's serviceability buffers. We don't need 3%. You don't need to be serviced to make sure you can borrow 3% more than the current interest rates, because interest rates are going down or will be going down. Another thing APRA could do is allow banks to lend to investors with higher loan-to-value ratios. So not just charge them extra interest as they are now, but lower the interest rate to investors, allow them to have maybe higher loan-to-value ratios, because they're protected not just by their own income, but by that of the tenant as well. And if they did this, they've also got to provide more certainty. I mean, investors want certainty, but that's another discussion. But if we're talking about factors that drive the property markets up and down, the availability of credit's one, and if the regulators make it easier, property values are going to go up. And I believe later this year, interest rates are going to fall. And it's very likely in due course APRA is going to decrease its serviceability buffer, which is out of kilter today. And that's going to create the next wave, the reset for our property markets. Of course, what that means is currently there's a window of opportunity if you've got a steady job and if you're in the right position to take advantage of the cycle at the moment before it moves on. I'm not saying try and time the market, but there's a window of opportunity because there's a whole lot of drivers that are going to still keep pushing up property values. And when confidence returns, when interest rates drop, when serviceability buffers drop, when tax cuts come in, the market's going to move on. So we're talking about factors that you need to understand as a property investor that are going to drive property values. And another one's general economic conditions. That's an important one. I'm talking about things like employment and unemployment, I guess also inflation. You see, when the economy's doing well, when people have got jobs, when they feel secure, they look to improve their financial situation. They look to upgrade their home. And that's one of the factors that created the boom of 2021, but over the last couple of years, as interest rates rose, as inflation created challenges, as the media scared us about potential recessions, as the cost of living for many Australians rose, many potential property purchasers, home buyers and investors just sat on the sideline. Economic uncertainty is one of the factors that negatively affects consumer confidence, slows down their property purchase decisions. And that's what's happened over the last little while. Having said that, the sentiment has changed. There now is a sense that inflation is under control, that interest rates have peaked, and so more buyers are getting into the market. Consumer confidence, in my mind, actually sums up a whole lot of factors that makes eventually consumers decide to make decisions. Big decisions like buying a home or buying an investment property. You don't make that unless you're confident about your financial future, your job security, and the economic future. So increasing consumer confidence is going to, well, it's already started. I mean, it's coming from very, very low levels. Over the last year or two, consumer confidence has been the sort of levels that we didn't experience since the global financial crisis. So it just creates a sort of herd mentality because when everyone feels comfortable, they just go out and spend more. But of course, over the last couple of years, the opposite has happened. When the Reserve Bank wanted to slow down our spending, it wanted to slow down economic growth, it wanted to slow inflation, so consumer confidence is low, and the media has been full of stories creating fear. But now we've moved on, and it's almost the opposite because we're seeing investors at Metropole. We've never been as busy, ever actually, with as many investors and lots of home buyers as well, wanting to get into the market before they see a reset later this year. And an element of FOMO, fear of missing out, has returned because there's just not enough good properties for, well, not just Metropole's clients, but buyers in general. So I'm working my way through some of the factors that drive property values up in the short term. And another one to consider, and boy did we see a lot of it over the COVID period, is government incentives, and in particular for first home buyers. You see, when the government wanted to inject demand into the markets or increase employment or increase the economy during the years of the pandemic or afterwards, but this has happened in the past, it frequently gives incentives to first home buyers. And look how well that worked over the COVID period. We had first homeowner grants and incentives and building incentives, and it boosts jobs in the construction industry, as well as in many other retail industries. I mean, if you think about it, the government knows that when you buy a new home, you've got to buy carpets and curtains and televisions. So they look at first home buyers as a great way of pumping industry, of greasing the wheels of industry. Today, the Labor government's looking at a number of other potential grant programs. There's all the fuss about affordability, and the government doesn't want to go into the next election next year with the media full of stories about lack of affordability. So it's going to be looking at programs. It's already talking about programs to stimulate first home buyers. In some ways, I'm sure they're wanting to help first home buyers, but also to counter the negative media. But if history repeats itself, and it surely will, these home buyers are just going to push up property values. You give them a bit more money and they spend a bit more money, and it actually negates the aim of increasing affordability. I remember last time there were grants like this years ago. I didn't call them first home buyer grants. I called them established homeowner grants because the first home buyers took their money and spent it and gave it to people who already owned the property. Anyway, we're talking about factors that affect the property markets, and government interference is one. On the positive side, like I mentioned a moment ago, with grants, but also on the negative side. We've spoken about it before. The governments have been fiddling with tenancy laws, and that's happening in a number of states because tenancy laws are state-based laws. And other governments are using property investors as an ATM and keeps taxing them, and that's causing more investors to leave the market. You see, another factor that does affect property values is investor appetites. In general, investors make up about 30% of property purchases, and currently investors are being a bit selective in which states they're investing in. Now, that's a short-term factor, but they're looking at how governments look at investors. In my mind, that's short-sighted because it's just creating a further significant shortage of properties, which is going to push up rentals and eventually property values. But remember, 70% of properties are bought by owner-occupiers. They're the main ones that drive our property markets, while investor sentiment creates booms when a lot of investors get in the market and similarly leads to the downturns when investors step back or sell up. Now, another important factor to consider of what's pushing up property values is really household formation. This is often overlooked. It's actually much more important than population growth, because what increases the demand for housing isn't really the number of people living in a city or in our country, but the number of dwellings needed to accommodate them. This works in a number of ways, with more young adults staying home longer at the moment because of the cost of housing deposits, the trend for more multi-generational households with affordability issues, and more friends and family members pooling their resources. Some are renting together or buying a property to share. It's possible the number of dwellings required may decrease a little bit in the future per capita. But really, when we decide how much demand there is, it's actually not people, household formation. Of course, on the other hand, there are more older Australians living in one or two people households, and often this evens out the numbers because baby boomers are not going into nursing homes. They're not going into tree change or sea change. What they're doing is staying in their homes. Another factor affecting housing markets over the last little while, and it's going to be a major factor moving forward. And if you've been following my regular podcast with Simon Kirstenmacher, you'll understand the importance of demographics, is the myriad of millennials entering family formation age, and them now going to be moving out of apartments, moving into houses or townhouses in the suburbs. So as we're talking about the factors affecting our housing markets, household formation is important. And I really did sort of mention demographics a moment ago. Projections from the Australian Bureau of Statistics suggest by the end of this decade, our population, which is about 27 million now, is going to reach around 30 million people by the turn of this decade, by 2030, and will be almost 40 million Australians by the middle of the century. 27 million people now, and it took, over 220 years to get there, and we're going to get another 13 million people, so about half the number again by the middle of this century. If you think about it, that's virtually like adding another Melbourne, Sydney and Brisbane to our population, and all these people are going to need to live somewhere. It's estimated that we're going to need to build one more dwelling for every 3 currently existing dwellings just to accommodate them. And, of course, our borders are open and more people are coming to live in Australia, in the safe country that we've got. And so, as we know, we've got to build, the government's suggesting 1.2 million dwellings in the next 5 years. We've never built as many as that before. But as an investor, you should be asking yourself, where will those new dwellings and where will the associated population be and where will the infrastructure spending be? We've spoken about that a lot in previous podcasts, and I've got a few more points I want to get through, so I'm not going to explain that now, but that's what you've got to look at, not the historic information in the past. Don't look in the rear vision mirror. You have an accident when you look in the rear vision mirror rather than looking forward. You've got to look at where economic growth is going to occur, where population growth is going to occur, and a huge percentage of it is going to be in the 3 big capital cities. What sort of people, what sort of economic jobs people are going to have moving forward, and I'd be wanting to invest where higher paid knowledge workers are, because they're the ones who are going to be able to afford to buy homes or rent your properties. The population growth corridors of our city tend to be poorer capital growth locations because there's abundant new supply, and that's the enemy of capital growth. At the same time, these locations will tend to have new families and migrants move there, and this demographic, and it's not a judge of people, but this demographic tends to have very little spare cash at the end of the month. They're areas where the ability to push up the value of properties is not going to be the same as the high wage earning areas. Now, as we talk about the factors that affect our housing markets, clearly affordability is an issue. Affordability encompasses dwelling prices, employment rates, wages, interest rates, credit supply, GDP growth, inflation. So whether or not someone can afford to buy a property is never just about the price tag attached to the home itself. A couple of years ago, when interest rates were very low, monthly mortgage repayments were lower than we'd ever seen, and that created a once-in-a-generation boom where property values increased 25 to 30% in many locations. Yet during that time, wages only increased minimally. And now it's the other way around. Interest rates are high and they are going to fall, but they're not going to go anywhere back to the sort of rates they were before. And I believe this is going to create a two-tier property market. The more highly skilled, highly paid workers will be able to afford to pay more for their homes, while the average working-class Australian won't have more money in their pockets to pay another $100,000 or $200,000 for their home. In other words, investors should avoid blue-collar areas and young family suburbs and seek out suburbs where wages growth is higher than the state averages. These are locations where investors, or people, can afford to and are prepared to live, but prepared to pay a premium to live. And in particular, I'd be looking at gentrifying middle ring suburbs of our capital cities. This cycle around, it's more the middle ring suburbs that are gentrifying, where the old houses are being pulled down and new apartments and townhouses are being built. Now, some of the other factors that are affecting our housing markets at the moment is, well, we talked about finance already, and I think I've explained to you that property investment's a game of finance with some houses thrown in the middle. But we also got to talk about wealth, wages growth and jobs creation. Our economy is still growing strongly. A bit stronger than the Reserve Bank would like, and that's why they haven't been able to drop interest rates yet. And even though unemployment is creeping up, jobs are still being created. And when people feel financially secure in their jobs, remember, even though unemployment's got a 4 in front of it, during the mining boom a decade or two ago, that's actually how low we actually got to unemployment figures. So still, anyone who wants a job can get a job. And if they do feel financially secure in the job, as I said before, they tend to make significant purchasing decisions like buying homes, buying cars. Interestingly, artificial intelligence experts have estimated that anywhere from 20 to 40% of all jobs could be taken over by AI and robots in the future, meaning there's going to be fewer unemployment opportunities for unskilled workers and those who perform repetitive tasks. Of the jobs that remain, others are going to go offshore to take advantage of cheaper labour and further slashing certain local jobs. I guess that means we're going to have fewer people doing more productive work. All of this could impact buyers' ability to save deposits, secure finance, pay mortgages, and in turn that could influence house prices. On the other hand, highly skilled knowledge workers are going to keep earning more than the average, and they're going to be in the position to buy new homes or upgrade their current homes. Again, explaining what I was saying a short while ago about just being careful about the demographics of where you buy. So in the short term, I've just gone through a whole lot of factors, but I believe as this year pans out, the cycle will move on. In due course, people are going to realise that interest rates are going to fall, inflation's coming under control, and before interest rates fall, I mean, when they do fall, boy, the market's going to heat up as people can afford more. But there's others who are in the position to buy properties or buy investments, but not doing anything yet because they're still a bit uncertain. As I said, I've noticed a palpable change in market sentiment recently, but when the crowd knows about it, the market's going to reset later this year. I'm going to explain a bit about the long-term growth of property in just a second, but if you're serious about getting involved in property investment and you're not sure is it the right time or not, at least get your ducks in a row for when it isn't the right time. Now, my team at Metropole are much, much more than buyer's agents. We are big enough to tip the scales in your favour, but still small enough to care. And when you come and have a chat with my team, the first thing we do is talk about where you are, where you want to go, put a strategic plan together for you, help you plan to become the people you plan to become, and then we'll help you implement the plan. So the plan really is, for many of our clients, they're wanting to have choices in life. But for a lot of them at the moment, they're looking for clarity and direction. They're looking for safety. They know that most investors never get to the next stage. They never get past their first or second property. A recent audit of the clients' results, our clients' results at Metropole, showed they're 7.3 times more likely to own 6 or more properties than the average investor. They've made the right decisions because they've been given the right advice. So if you want to outperform the averages, if you'd like an unfair advantage, have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au and let's see how we can help you. Have a chat and see where we can go. As I said, we're much, much more than buyer's agents. What I've been talking about up to now is what's going to create property values to go up and down in the short term. But what I now want to spend a couple of minutes talking to you about is what is going to keep property values increasing over the long term. Because there's people out there saying, can't happen, keep increasing. Again, I've been around long enough to hear those stories before. I don't remember them in the 1970s, to be honest, when I first started investing, but I do remember in the 1980s, people were saying, property values can't keep increasing. Our kids, our grandkids will never be able to afford property. But at that stage, properties were so much cheaper than today. Now, inflation is one of the reasons property values go up. So if you believe inflation is going to continue on, then you've got to own the right sort of assets that increase with inflation. But it's much, much more than that. I believe over the long term, what's going to keep happening is demographics are going to drive our markets, how we are, how many of us there are, how we want to live, where we want to live. And the generations, as I explained, millennials and baby boomers are going to keep driving the property cycle over the next couple of decades. Future population growth is going to be an important factor, but also the wealth of the nation. So as a investor, you really should be studying demographics, and that's why I regularly have Simon Kirstenmacher on this show. But there's a triple boost to the economy and to our property markets moving forward. The triple boost for demand for housing. We're going to have that very strong population growth where in the early 2030s, we're going to have over 30 million Australians, and by the middle of the century, 40 million Australians. Our population is going to almost go up by 50%, but a lot of those people are going to be in higher paying jobs and earning more money, and so they're the ones who are going to be able to afford to buy properties. But where are all these people going to live? Well, no one knows for certain, but according to ID Demographics, who do a lot of research and planning for state and federal governments, they're suggesting that 67% of the forecast growth will occur in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Perth. So Melbourne's going to get the bulk, not Victoria. Melbourne is going to get the bulk. 23% of all that population growth is going to go to Melbourne. 18% to Sydney, 14% to Brisbane and 12% to Perth, and only maybe about 2% to Canberra. And so that's partly because of just the way Australia lives. More than 50% of our population is in 3 cities. 51% of our population lives in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. This is many fewer cities than in the United Kingdom, where half the population lives in 9 of the largest cities, and even more so compared to the United States, where 36 cities contain half the population. So as a result, the amount of desirable land where people want to live in Australia is much more concentrated. And the suggestion is over the next 30 years, the portion of Australians' population who are going to keep moving into wanting to live in our 3 big capital cities is expected to increase further. So at the moment, it's around 51% of the population living in the 3 biggest cities, and it's suggested by the middle of this century, 57% will. So we know more are going to move to regional areas. Some regional areas are going to do well, but why fight the big trends when the vast majority of our higher wage earning population is going to live in our capital cities, our 3 big capital cities? So the future is bright for property investors. Demographics is going to dictate the future of our property markets. Again, keep going back to the same trend. Australia is going to keep growing. Our economy is going to keep growing. The work from home revolution isn't going to change, so the sort of houses we need are going to be bigger. Everyone needs a Zoom room. And remember, the millennials who are currently living in apartments are now going to need to have another bedroom or two for their kids and a Zoom room. Baby boomers and millennials are moving to the next phase of their lives, and they're going to drive the cycles. Baby boomers are probably going to keep right-sizing, and some are going to move down to slightly smaller accommodation, but millennials are going to keep driving the market. And as I said, our workforce is changing. We're getting more higher paid workers in Australia as we have a knowledge-based society. So, as I started to say, the future for our property markets is bright, but you've got to take a long-term view, because between now and then, the market's going to keep cycling, as it always has. That's what it does. So thank you for putting up with this very long conversation with just you and me today, but I hope it's given you some insights into what's ahead, but even more importantly, some comfort in the fact that if you own the right sort of properties, you're very likely to grow a level of wealth. If you own a big enough portfolio, you too can enjoy the financial freedom that that small group of investors who've done it right in the past have done. There's lots of opportunities. And if you'd like to understand what your options are, as I said a while ago, have a chat with my team at Metropole. Go to metropole.com.au. We're much more than buyer's agents. We help our clients safely outperform the averages and grow into generational wealth. We'll give you some certainty, some clarity in these interesting times.
Now here's Michael's mindset message. Remember, a change in your thinking will lead to a change in your life.
In my mindset message today, I want to share with you my thought that everybody is doing their best. I believe that's true. Everyone is really trying to do the best they can. Now, I used to think people weren't doing the best that they could. I used to get frustrated when things weren't delivered on schedule or on budget. I used to get upset if things didn't go according to my expectations. And I guess I was much more arrogant. I used to judge people as incompetent. But I've now come to realise that if I choose to think that everybody shows up to do their best, the best that they can, it puts me in a better state when I'm communicating with them. If somebody in the office is struggling, they're doing their best. If your assistant is having difficulty following their instructions, think about it. They're probably doing their best. If a client doesn't listen to my advice, it used to annoy me and frustrate me. I realise they're thinking differently to me. They are doing their best. Nobody wants to do the wrong thing. If the coffee barista makes me wait for my coffee, they're doing their best coping with what they've got at the time. Now, your parents who taught you things that were not useful, there's stuff I learned as a child that I would rather have not or seen. I would rather not. They were still doing their best. Everyone's got a story. Everyone's got strengths and limitations. Everyone's seeing and experiencing the world as they see it, not as the way you see it. So I've learned that when you suspend judgment, you realise that your day-to-day certainties are far less concrete than you think, and you surprise yourself on how instantly things change. They change when you change. More importantly, you'll be amazed at how people perform when you earnestly say to them, "Thank you. Thank you. I know you're doing your best." Well, thanks for spending the last little while with me, and I hope you got some benefit from this show. If you did, and you know somebody else who'd also benefit, please tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. There's a share button on every podcast app. On Apple Podcasts, there's 3 little buttons down the bottom. Press it and share it, or just tell them about the Michael Yardney podcast. I hope you're going to be doing them a favour, and you'll definitely be doing me a favour and helping me in my quest to make as many people as possible financially literate. Now, there's ways of catching up with me between these shows. Just look for Michael Yardney on social media, or why not join my private Facebook group? Go to Facebook and look for the Property Update Facebook group. And I have a way of saying thank you to you for subscribing to this podcast. Go to podcastbonus.com.au. There'll be a link in the show notes, podcastbonus.com.au, where you can get a bunch of ebooks and reports. My way of saying thank you. And when you've got time, why not listen to some of the old podcasts? There's individual lessons in each of those that I think would be helpful for you. I'll be back again real soon. In the meantime, have a great week. Make it a great week.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Michael Yardney podcast, which was brought to you by Metropole, who help their clients grow, protect, and pass on their wealth through strategic property and wealth advice. If you like what you heard and don't already subscribe, you'll find us on iTunes or on your favourite Android app as the Michael Yardney podcast. Watch out for our next show, which comes to you twice a week, and you'll learn some new ideas about property investment, success, and money in around 30 minutes. To get more of Michael's thoughts, go across to www.propertyupdate.com.au and sign up for his daily morning briefing, and you'll hear from not only Michael but a group of leading property success and money experts. And just a reminder that the information you heard in this show today is general educational advice and not specific investment advice, as we don't know your personal circumstances. If you're looking for specific advice, why not ask the team at Metropole to help you?